From November of 1975 until April 2002, the country of Angola was host to one of the longest-running African civil wars, a prime example of Cold War meddling, exploitation of a resource-rich nation, and ethnic division. The Angolan Civil War was caused by multiple factors. As many as 800,000 people lost their lives during the conflict, with over 4 million refugees created by the carnage. In today's video, we will cover the causes of the Angolan Civil War, the horrors inflicted, and the aftermath of one of the more disturbing civil wars in history. It is perhaps helpful to start with the Portuguese colonization and how the country of Angola was formed as a result. Portuguese traders established relations with the Congo Empire for the purpose of purchasing African slaves from local slavers. These people were sold as part of the Atlantic slave trade. Although the slave trade was ended in the 1830s, the trade of slaves continued regardless. During the scramble for Africa, the country of Angola as we know today was formed. Boundaries were drawn to create new countries. Little to no regard was given for the different tribes, ethnic groups, or peoples who found themselves part of a new country. In the 1960s, a movement for independence took hold. A strike at a cotton plantation saw Angolan workers fight against Portuguese colonial authorities for the very first time. The strike was initially against working conditions, but it soon spread to be about Portuguese control, the widespread use of Angolan forced labour, and the destruction of Angolan culture. On the 4th of January 1961, workers refused to pay any taxes, refused to work, and held Portuguese overseers captive. But this revolt would be put down by the Portuguese Air Force using napalm-style bombs to deadly effect, killing between 400 and 7,000 people. This strike did lead to other acts of rebellion, with liberation groups engaging in violence. As a result, the National Liberation Front of Angola, or the FNLA, launched a revolt in northern Angola, fighting against Portuguese colonial forces. As many as 1,000 white Angolans were killed, some of the dead mutilated in truly grim displays. Over the coming months, 20,000 black Angolans were killed in the counter-insurgency that followed. The FNLA were not alone, with many other liberation groups formed, often along ethnic lines. For example, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA, was largely formed by the Mbundu people, and they were Marxist in political ideology, meaning they were communists. And then there was the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, otherwise known as UNITA. This group was largely formed of the Ovimbunda people, a conservative right-wing political movement, and was based in the south of Angola. At one point, UNITA had followed a Maoist communist ideology, with backing from the People's Republic of China. However, with insufficient support from China and unable to form alliances with other liberation groups, UNITA looked elsewhere for support and for political ideology. These groups all engaged in the struggle for independence, though they often fought against one another. Initial ethnic dividing lines soon gave way to ideological divides, making collaboration that much harder. Based in neighbouring countries, these groups launched guerrilla attacks on the Portuguese for years. The end of the Portuguese colonial rule would come not from the liberation movement, but rather through the Carnation Revolution of 1974 in Portugal. This brought an abrupt stop to Portugal's colonial endeavours. 500,000 white Angolans left the country, with these people being most of the skilled workers and administrators of the country. On the 11th of November 1975, the leader of the MPLA declared the independence of the People's Republic of Angola. This leader's name was Agostinho Neto. Meanwhile, the NFLA and UNITA united, and they declared their own rival government on the 23rd of November. The Democratic People's Republic of Angola was led by the FNLA's Holden Roberto and UNITA's Jonas Savimbi, with the two men acting as co-presidents. The MPLA, with Cuban and Soviet support, quickly crushed the FNLA, and UNITA was unable to match the MPLA's combined military might, although they had more support from the people of Angola. Even though Angola was now an independent country, the various factions were still fighting one another. Even with the departure of their shared enemy of Portugal, Angola would be broken by many more years of the conflict that was still to come. Within this power vacuum, other countries sought to protect their interests in the resource-rich country. Attempts at power sharing between the UNITA and the MPLA failed, plunging the country into a civil war. Soldiers from South Africa worked alongside UNITA, whilst Cuban troops aided the MPLA. Angola became one of the many stages for the Cold War to play out. Thousands of foreign soldiers flooded the country, often clashing with one another. Other liberation groups fell in or merged with one of these two major groups. Cities were captured and controlled by one of the movements as they fought to claim control of the country. As the MPLA had control of the capital city of Luanda and of the oil fields on the Atlantic coast, they had plenty of resources to help fund the conflict. In the end, the MPLA with Cuban and Soviet backing were able to defeat the UNITA and push them into the bush. Savimbi sought additional support for UNITA, looking to the United States for further aid. In the 1970s, Savimbi managed to secure secret funding from President Gerald Ford's government. Around $50 million was sent to UNITA and the FNLA, and years later, Savimbi was able to secure a close relationship with the Ronald Reagan administration. Throughout the conflict, both sides utilized child soldiers. It is thought that UNITA used at least 6,000 child soldiers in total. Some were used as frontline fighters, whilst others were used as porters or messengers. Younger children were often given the porter roles, whilst the older children were pressed into becoming soldiers. According to one survivor by the name of Manuel, he was first forced by UNITA to become a porter when he was just 13. He and 30 other children were soon trained how to fire AK-47s, and then they were sent to the front lines. He recalled how he was often sick with malaria and often left starved due to lack of supplies. Some of the children were even pressed into service by family members, assisting their uncles or fathers into the bush as they continued to fight. In 1987, the largest tank battle in Africa since the Second World War saw the Angolan People's Army with Cuban support clash with UNITA and South African forces. The battle saw almost 10,000 dead and many more wounded, with the MPLA forces struggling to gain ground. The battle was a major turning point, as the following peace talks saw Cuban and South African troops leave Angola. In 1991, the MPLA and UNITA reached an agreement, paving the way for their soldiers to lay down their arms and to allow for elections to take place. The communist state was to be transitioned into a multi-party democratic nation. All parties were to be allowed to take part in the 1992 elections that would take place once the last foreign troops were to leave. Around this time, Savimbi reportedly purged his rivals to leadership of UNITA in preparation for the elections. MPLA won the election with almost 50% of the vote, with UNITA obtaining around 40%. UNITA claimed that the results were rigged in the MPLA's favour, pointing to an estimated 500,000 UNITA voters who were unable to cast a ballot. In response, UNITA prepared for the continuation of the civil war. UNITA members and delegates were massacred in countrywide popular acts of violence, though such acts were likely government-endorsed. One notable example was the Halloween Massacre on the 30th of October. A gunfight between Angolan police and UNITA soldiers at an airport saw 12 civilians killed. UNITA responded with further attacks against security forces as the police set up roadblocks throughout the city. Weapons were distributed by the MPLA to its supporters, as UNITA supporters' homes and buildings were raided. Thousands of UNITA supporters were murdered during these raids. They were summarily executed or detained. At police stations, UNITA prisoners were executed one after another, buried in mass graves. People armed with clubs, machetes and pistols went from house to house and searched the squatter camps, dragging out those they suspected of being UNITA supporters and butchered them. One of the notable victims of the massacre was Jeremias Chitunda. Jeremias was UNITA's vice president sent by Savimbi to negotiate a second round of voting. On the 2nd of November, his convoy was ambushed, pulling Jeremias from his car and shooting him in the face. They then displayed his corpse on television. UNITA therefore resumed the civil war, launching a number of attacks on key cities throughout Angola. The thawing of the Cold War saw the end of funding coming from South Africa and the United States to UNITA, but they desperately needed funding. In 1990, British diamond company De Beers signed a deal with Angolan companies to purchase diamonds from the war-torn country, diamonds otherwise known as blood diamonds. UNITA held most of Angola's diamond-rich territories, selling blood diamonds to fund the war. Diamond miners were forced under threat of violence to work in horrendous conditions. Those who lived in the poorer villages were often beset by the horrors of the war. They were targeted and pressed into providing workers. Billions of dollars were raised by selling these diamonds, even in the face of strict controls and UN resolutions prohibiting the trade. Much of the money raised was used to purchase weapons, but plenty ended up in the pockets of UNITA commanders. In 1994, attempts at peace were made. This was an attempt to integrate members of UNITA within the Angolan security forces and to arrange the disarmament of UNITA rebels. In exchange, the MPLA government would release and give amnesty to UNITA prisoners it held. Both sides agreed not to purchase any foreign weaponry. However, when the treaty was to be signed, Savimbi did not attend, and it ultimately collapsed due to distrust between the two parties, and foreign weaponry continued to be purchased. North Korea, Ukraine, Russia, France, and the United States through Israel all continued to supply weapons. A UN peacekeeping force was sent to Angola with no-fly zone set up over UNITA territory. UNITA turned to ever more terroristic tactics. On the 10th of August 2001, UNITA forces used an anti-tank mine to derail a train transporting refugees. One derailed, and UNITA soldiers executed some 250 people with automatic rifles, which equated to over half of those on board. The war only came to an end once Savimbi was killed in an MPLA attack on the 22nd of February 2002. His successor was injured in the same attack and died a few days later from his wounds. Shortly after, UNITA sought a peaceful end to the war that had raged on for 27 years. UNITA soldiers and their families were granted amnesty, some 350,000 people. UNITA has since formed the main oppositional party to the MPLA government, able to secure under 44% of the vote in the 2022 elections. As for the MPLA, the fall of the Soviet Union saw a political U-turn as to its ideology. It is no longer a Marxist communist party, it is a social democratic party that remains in power to this day. The Angolan Civil War continued for far too long, with atrocities committed by both sides. Both the MPLA and UNITA used child soldiers, many forced into the combat with a threat of violence. UNITA would kidnap and press young girls into sexual slavery, rewarding its commanders with wives. Those who refused were beaten, and those who tried to escape were killed. As many as 8,000 girls were forced into these marriages. Some girls were used as rewards for victorious fighters, who upon their return would select the girl they wished to abuse. When not being SA'd, they would be forced to cook and scavenge for food. In total, both sides used over 15 million landmines, creating a major risk of death and over 70,000 casualties. It is thought that as many as 800,000 people were killed during the Civil War. Many of the civilians who passed away died due to famine, landmines, or disease, all caused by the war. At its peak, as many as 200 people died a day due to a lack of food, water, or medicine. Over 4 million people were internally displaced, left without access to medicine and clean water. The life expectancy plummeted to only 40 years. And yet, for some in Angola, there has been a dramatic increase in the standard of living. Thanks to its abundance of oil, diamonds, and copper, Angola has one of the fastest growing global economies. However, for most Angolans, they are considered poor, and there is much economic and social inequality. The decades of war are now behind Angola, and yet the scars still remain.